Hello, my Wolfpack, Charlie Black 20 back again, and today I'm going to be giving a historical opinion about what I think were the two fatal moves of both the German army under the Nazis in World War II and the Japanese army in World War II, or at least the Chinese Sino War. I'm sorry, the Japanese Sino War. So, a lot of people think that Hitler's biggest mistake was declaring war on the United States, fighting a two-front war, invading the Soviet Union in the first place, many other reasons. I actually happen to think that although Germany didn't have a big chance of winning the war, especially once they invaded the Soviets, there was always a chance. Not a good one, but a chance. The problem is that the way to win the war for the Germans, the only way they could have won it, in my opinion, is if they weren't Nazis. Now, here's what I mean by that. When the German army invaded the Soviet Union, Hitler issued explicit orders and explicit ideology that this was going to be a war of annihilation, that you could not treat the Soviets, soldiers, citizenry, anybody involved with the Communist Party, you could not treat them as anything close to equals. You couldn't show them mercy. You had to be ruthless. And you had to show them at all times through violence and humiliation and cruelty that the Germans were the superior race. This led to him issuing what is known as the Commissar Order. This was an order given to the German military officers that any Soviet commissar who was captured was to be summarily executed. That is a gross violation of the rules of war. They were to show no mercy to captured Red Army soldiers. So there was no plan to feed, house, or take care of Soviet prisoners of war in 1941. This was done intentionally by Hitler and accepted by the generals. So when Soviet prisoners were captured by the hundreds of thousands and eventually millions, they were put into open fields surrounded by barbed wire, given no food, no medicine, shot if they tried to escape, and allowed to become feral animals if they survived. A few would be taken away as laborers. Some who were Ukrainians would be either forced or volunteer to join the SS as auxiliaries and guards for various camps. But there was over a 60% fatality rate among Soviet prisoners of war captured by the Germans. And then you also had the civilians who were, if you weren't considered German, you were treated to the worst behavior. Obviously, the Jews were murdered by the SS and by elements of the German army who either participated or would take up auxiliary positions where they would guard prisoners, they would provide ammo, rifles, trucks, things like that. So the Wehrmacht and the SS, although they weren't working, I would say they were working hand in glove, to put it lightly. And again, I'm trying to be as fair as I can, although I don't know why. I guess it's just my historical nature. I think that this cost the Germans their chance to beat the Soviet Union. And what I mean by that is this. There were plenty of people who hated Stalin, who did not like the Soviet Union, who did not like the communists. There were plenty of that. People who were very afraid, people who wanted to be liberated. The Ukrainians, when they were first invaded by the Germans, they saw it as a war of liberation for themselves. That the Germans were coming to kick the Stalin loyalists and the communists out. It very quickly becomes apparent that that's not what's going to happen. Although some SS are recruiting Ukrainians, for the most part, anybody who isn't considered German, who is considered a Slav, a Jew, a Gypsy, or sympathetic to the communists, or just plain ordinary people, stand no chance against the brutality and atrocities and cruelty that is visited upon them by the German army and SS. They are treated not even as second-class citizens, but as subjects to be terrorized, stolen from, ordered around. Anything you could think of that you think of as dehumanizing, the German army and the SS did on a mass scale. Obviously, there were exceptions, but that's why they're called exceptions. They weren't the norm. And so this very quickly turns most of the citizenry of the Soviet Union and anybody who believed in defending Mother Russia against the Nazis and the German war effort. And I think one piece of evidence I have is that I think kind of proves me right, in my opinion, is that there was a German general. His name was von Kleist. He was not a Nazi, he was a monarchist. But he did not oppose the Nazis, and he was given a high rank during the invasion of Russia, eventually made a field marshal, due to his various successes on the battlefield. But by 1943, the Germans are running out of manpower. They have lost at Stalingrad, they are losing ground in North Africa, and so they need new troops. But the problem is that they don't trust their auxiliaries, who are mainly guarding the camps of Jews in concentration camps, and they're forcing others to do labor for them, slave labor in factories and other places, and they can't trust their workers. So how are they going to trust troops in the field if they have this racialized ideology? Well, what von Kleist does is he countermands the Commissar order, and he brings discipline back to his army by saying, listen, I want to fight Stalin. I want to beat Stalin. So we're not going to do any more of these atrocities. We're not going to do any more of this forced labor. We're going to recruit from the country we're in to bring in troops who want to beat the communists. And this nets him a little over 800,000 men, mostly Cossacks, to fight the Soviet Union. Obviously, it's not enough, but apparently reports of this got back to Germany, got back to Berlin, and von Kleist got away with it because they're like, hey, this isn't authorized, this is bad, but it seems to be working, so let's just turn a blind eye. Other German officers did not do this. Von Kleist seems to be the major exception. So, although the SS did recruit from other nationalities, they never trusted them particularly. There were French, British, Norwegian, Swedish, and other units that were used in operations against Jews. So I'm actually of the opinion that if the Nazis had focused only on the Jews, or had not done any of their atrocities, if they had not been Nazis, then they had a chance to beat the Soviet Union from recruiting other people against the Soviet Union, because they needed the manpower, they needed the supplies, but the way they acted formed partisan units. It turned everybody against, so many against them, and quite honestly, it was stupid. It was all about racial ideology, not necessarily about winning against a nation. So that's what I think was the gravest mistake of the German war effort in the Soviet Union, and what ultimately would result in much of their defeat. Not all of it, but much of it. That was their biggest mistake that could have been avoided. But the problem is you have to stop them from being Nazis. With the Japanese, it was their treatment of the Chinese people and their war effort in China. You see, the Chinese army, both nationalist army and communist guerrillas, were no match for the Japanese army on the field of battle in a straight up fight. They just didn't have the supplies. They did not have the discipline for the large scale of their army. They had individual units, they had good officers, but they did not have the cohesion that the Japanese army had built over, I think it was about 80 years of work on cohesion, as well as success that the Japanese had in Manchuria. They had veterans. They had men who understood how to fight in a modern context. The Chinese really didn't, at least not to a large scale. So when the Japanese attack in 1937 from Manchuria into mainland China, they quickly overwhelm the Chinese mainland, the Chinese borders, and then they repel the Chinese attack at Shanghai and pursue them, defeat them at Nanking, where you have the atrocity, the rape of Nanking. I've discussed that in the 3 good Nazi videos. And but then the Japanese army and military make a mistake. They continue to pursue the Chinese into the interior. They continue to be brutal, cruel, and just as bad as the Germans towards the Chinese. As bad as the Germans were to the Soviet prisoners of war and civilians, that's how bad the Japanese were to the Chinese. That was the extremes right there. And this war would cause Japan to become bogged down in China. China is just too big a pill for the Japanese army to swallow. They don't have the resources, they don't have the oil, they don't have what they need to conquer and control the Chinese mainland. They can terrorize it, they can steal from it, but they can't conquer it. So this puts the military in a bind politically and strategically. They're stuck fighting the Chinese, and they can't get more fuel to do this because there's an oil embargo on them from the United States. And so this puts them in a bind. They tried attacking the Soviet Union. It failed. They made a peace agreement. And now they're running out of resources. Especially oil, as I mentioned. But the U.S. is squeezing the oil and holding it hostage, basically saying, hey, if you don't get out of China, we're not going to be sending you oil. So, strategically, they are stuck. They either have to attack the United States and hope that they can win a victory and get that oil that they need from other areas of the Pacific that are controlled by the US and the British and the French, or they have to pull out of China and admit failure and weakness, in their minds at least. Attacking the United States at least made strategic sense in that they were making a strategic decision to avoid the quagmire of China in the moment to try and gain a strategic military advantage by stopping the U.S. from ever entering the war on a strong foot by attacking Pearl Harbor and destroying its capabilities in the Pacific. They did not succeed, but at least it made logical sense. It did not make logical sense for them to attack mainland China. This was brought on by younger officers within the Japanese military who wanted to attack the Chinese, and the Chinese obliged by fighting back at the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where both sides are amped up, both sides escalate, but the Japanese are the ones that caused it. And so This quagmire of China is extremely similar to the quagmire of the Soviet Union that the Germans found themselves in. And because they were both so brutal and cruel, it eventually would cost them. The Soviets would end up destroying the German army in many offensives. The Chinese army was able to hold the Japanese army where it was, force them to send supplies over and troops over and over into this quagmire where they could not focus exclusively with the Navy and Air Force to the Pacific Ocean. So, my opinion is that these two issues are what cost Germany and Japan World War II in the end. At the very least, they were extremely major contributions. So, that is my historical opinion. I hope I didn't rant on too long for you guys. But take care of my wolf pack.